Well, thank you indeed. My name's Tim Dowse. I'm the Director of Cyber Policy at the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And after that very wide-ranging keynote address, I think it's underlined, really, the breadth of the challenge that faces governments, the private sector, and individuals when tackling this very complex and broad issue of cybersecurity and the importance of international cooperation. Now, the title of this panel discussion is Securing Cyberspace, How Are We Doing?, which I think should give our very distinguished panelists plenty of scope to both challenge us and perhaps answer some of our questions. I was struck by the straw poll that was taken at the beginning of this morning, that when asked whether governments understood and were the problems of cybersecurity and were committed to international cooperation to address them, there was really an extraordinary vote of confidence, frankly, in governments. Very encouraging for somebody who's a public policy maker to find that I think over 70% of the respondents thought that their governments either had a deep understanding and were deeply committed to international cooperation, or had some understanding and were working their way towards that. I mean, that was really the sort of result that I think many political parties would be delighted to achieve in terms of a vote of confidence. But then there was also a question that said, are the threats we face in cyberspace greater or less than a year ago, or the same? And there was an overwhelming vote there to say they're greater. So it seems that while governments have a vote of confidence for understanding and increasingly working together to meet these challenges, it doesn't seem to be making much difference. So perhaps we can't take too much comfort. Anyway, as I say, we have a very distinguished panel to address some of these issues, and I'd like to hand over to them now. After the panel have given their initial addresses, as with the previous session, we'll invite them to add additional comments. But then I'm hoping that we will have some time this time for some audience participation, and I hope to be able to take some questions and comments from the floor. But to start off with, though, I'd like to hand over to Francis Delon, the Secretary-General for Defence and National Security from Paris. And I'm also commissioned by the East West Institute to keep an eye on the time, so the dreaded green and red lights will affect the panel in this case just as much as they did in the previous one. But over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much also to the East West Institute and the organizer of this second edition of the Cyber Security Summit, the different workshops of which will show us that a lot has been done since the Dallas Summit. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend the Dallas Summit, but I'm happy to be present with you today and to participate in our discussions. And I hope that there will be time also for questions from the audience, as you said before, Tim. So my name is Francis Delon. As Tim said, I'm the Secretary General for Defense and Security in France. I am also responsible, under the authority of the Prime Minister, for cybersecurity policy in France. And the agency that is dealing with cyber defense in France is under my authority. Governments and companies from all over the world work hard, indeed, to secure digital communication networks and information systems against cyber attacks. But cyber criminals have not been idle during the past year. In addition to the usual attacks that are numerous and have benefited from a large media coverage, more sophisticated and more dangerous aggressions are detected but are not always publicized. The Stuxnet worm, which targeted the nuclear centrifuge control system of a facility used in the Iranian nuclear program, marks, according to me, the dawning of a new era for cyber attacks. A new era, as this event confirms the reality of the threat. Stuxnet has shown that it is possible to succeed in attacking an information system controlling an industrial process, even when physically disconnected from digital communication network. All our industrial process control system can, therefore, be considered as potential targets for determined attackers. A new era also because the analysis of Stuxnet malicious code shows that its designers have chosen to invest important human and financial resources in order to reach their objective. We have not observed so far such investment from the attackers that we faced until now. France, like other countries, has been the target of cyber attacks, such as the one we have made public a few weeks ago, and that aimed the information system of our ministries of economy and finance. Other institutions and companies are also targeted by aggressions, which show that attackers are increasing in competence. Therefore, in order to respond to the theme of this panel, what have we done since last year? France has actively taken part in the discussions and the work in international organizations such as the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union. I note, for instance, the establishment of a cert for the EU institutions starting today, June 1st. I note also the successful result obtained within the United Nations. All these initiatives, as well as the recent publication of the Cybersecurity International Strategy of the United States, show the existence of a collective will to work together with a reinforced international collaboration, and all this toward a safer cyberspace. I mentioned also the treaty between the United Kingdom and France on defense and security. This treaty includes cooperation on cyber defense and is, from this perspective, a very good example of cooperation. The importance of this international collaboration has indeed been reaffirmed in the French national strategy, which public version has been made public last February. This strategy states the will of France to protect its critical infrastructures and, more generally, to secure its companies and citizens in cyberspace. The progresses we have made are also operational. We continuously learn from the attacks that we thwart and we organize in consequence. Last Wednesday, for example, the French government has announced the establishment of additional measures in complement to the actions that have already been taken in order to significantly strengthen the French cyber defense capacities. In this field, our approach is similar with our main allies, in particular concerning our decision to establish a trustworthy partnership with critical infrastructure operators. From an institutional point of view, the French Network and Information Security Agency that reports to me has also become the national authority for the defense of information system. It is therefore in charge of coordinating the action in the field of cyber defense at an interministerial level. It had just been decided to double its workforce so that it should grow to reach 350 people during the next 2 years. As you can understand, the last 12 months in France have been very busy, progressing at high pace, just like our partners. Indeed, a lot of work is still to be done, and I refer in particular to our shyness to exchange at an operational level. This culture, largely inherited from our past, is no longer relevant, in my view, under the digital era and must be overcome. Our collective ability to work together is going to play a crucial role in the progresses that our society might achieve, as well as in building peace between nations. As a way ahead, motivated by the increasing risk of cyber attacks with major impact on critical infrastructures, France suggests that work should be done at an international level in order to raise the security and defense of our industrial information systems. In our view, two directions should be considered for which international cooperation is desirable. The first direction consists in agreeing on an evaluation scale for the severity of cyber attacks, similar to the one that is being used in the field of nuclear incidents. The second one consists in agreeing on norms of security that operators and manufacturers of industrial systems should conform to in order to secure these systems. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, allow me to respond to the initial question of this panel by another question. In the light of the actions already engaged by states, in particular those regarding the protection of critical infrastructures, can we still say that cyberspace has no frontiers? To tell the truth, I don't have this impression. If the borders of cyberspace do not follow our physical and political borders, they do exist and are becoming stronger. For the best, the defense in depth of our information system, and for the worst, by giving the possibility to cut access to all digital communication networks as a means to prevent citizens to communicate freely. In the 90s, some intellectuals announced the end of history and the disappearance of states that had become useless in a globalized economy, whereas we see today how much necessary they are in deadening international financial and economic crises. A similar approach to cyberspace would mislead us. Digital communication networks, and in particular the Internet, do not initiate the end of borders, and states have a key role to play in securing cyberspace. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Francis. And some challenging points at the end there. I would just note, of course, that some of these issues were taken up in the extremely substantive declaration issued by the G8 leaders after the Deauville summit just last week. So it's extremely topical, and it's valuable to have you give your views here today. Moving on, the next panelist is Latha Reddy, the Deputy National Security Advisor from India. I would say it's particularly valuable, not only for the keynote speaker, but to have a panelist from India. A lot of the time, I think it's true, here in the UK and in Europe, perhaps in North America, we we find ourselves talking to each other about issues of cybersecurity, and those of us from the security community inevitably do focus on the threats and the challenges, but we sometimes need to remember that the Internet provides enormous opportunities, and a lot of those opportunities and the countries that stand to benefit most from the growth of free trade, from free expression, from free exchange of ideas, and the opportunities for online business, those that stand most to benefit are in the developing world. And India is in a particularly unique position, because not only is India part of the developing world, but of course India is also a global centre of expertise for software and programming. So I particularly welcome to have an Indian panelist as well as the Indian keynote speaker. I'll hand over to Latha Reddy.
Thank you. I'm particularly delighted to be able to participate in this panel, but as I mentioned to you when we talked briefly before we began, the subject is securing cyberspace. How are we doing? But I think the question is, what do we need to do as well? Certainly we should examine what we've already done, both nationally and the beginnings of international cooperation in this area. But I think we really need to take a hard look, not just as how far we've come, but where we need to go. As far as India is concerned, nationally we do have IT Act, the Information Technology Act of 2000, which was amended in 2008. And under that, under domestic laws, we do have certain abilities to check cybersecurity and to protect ourselves against attacks nationally, as well as internationally, because we have defined cyber terrorism in the Act as whatever threatens the unity, integrity, security, or sovereignty of India, or attempts to strike terror in people by even denying access to computer resources, access computer resources without authority, induce computer contaminants, causes death or destruction of property, penetrates restricted computer resources or information affecting sovereignty, integrity, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency, contempt of court, defamation, or to the advantage of foreign states or groups of persons. So as you see, it gives a very wide range of powers to the government to deal with these issues. For cybersecurity, the government of India may order any intermediary to allow access to any computer resources, and any violation of this could result in imprisonment. The jurisdiction is not bounded by the country's boundaries if the target is a computer resource located in India. In other words, even if the attack is launched from elsewhere, if the resource attacked is in India, the jurisdiction of this law can apply. Any act done anywhere in the world is an offense under this act if it is an offense in India. Voluntary concealment of existence of a design by encryption or a hiding tool can be construed as an offense if done in order to damage another person's cyber system. And impersonation, disclosure of information in breach of contract. The reason I say this is because in theory we do have these acts. The question is, how well are they put into practice to defend us against attacks? Coming to attacks, I want to share with you some definitions of what cyber warfare can be defined as. Clausewitz said, war is an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. Sun Tzu, the 6th century BC Chinese philosopher, said, 100 victories in 100 battles is not the most skillful. Seizing the enemy without fighting is the most skillful. Cyber warfare has the essence of both these great definitions of military theorists, as it is a warfare which is capable of compelling the enemy to your will by inducing strategic paralysis to achieve the desired end, and seizing of the enemy is done almost without any application of physical force. This is what makes attacks on cyberspace so insidious. On international cooperation, I believe the final shape of international cooperation is yet to strike a balance between individual rights and collective responsibility, or between individual rights to information and privacy in cyberspace. While domestic laws and structures are in place in India, we feel that internationally there is a need to define jurisdictional boundaries more clearly and to create the structures and framework of cooperation. Some areas of international cooperation which we have outlined in the past as well are international norms on certification, levels of assurance, metrics, harmonized legal frameworks to deal with cybercrime and security, and improving cooperation among national law enforcement agencies and sharing of best practices in dealing with cybercrime and in protecting critical infrastructure. There are also larger legal issues involved. Does the principle of armed conflict apply to cyber conflict and attacks? Do laws governing the legality of war and laws on the conduct of war apply to cyber attacks? The difficulty of identifying perpetrators and the absence of common understanding increases instability and the risk of misperception in the international system, and hence effort by the international community is necessary. I think we can broadly define areas where we should be looking at cybersecurity cooperation internationally. We need to look at international regimes, rules of the road for responsible behavior in cyberspace, especially the use of malware, botnets, and viruses such as GhostNet. We need to identify such practices as criminal acts, identify them as theft, intellectual property violations, stealing of commercial secrets. We need to identify best practices in the use of cyberspace. We need to develop global cooperation and regimes against cyberterrorism and cybercrime. We need a global regime to protect the financial sector, data protection. And we need to define rules on what is use of force, acceptable and offensive capabilities, and particularly how do we define attacks against critical infrastructure which could paralyze the functioning of our nations. We also need to look at the question of how do you develop a legal regime that can make a state take action against non-state actors who are based in their territories. Because it is difficult to trace it to a government, but I would believe that it would be even more difficult to make a government take responsibility for a private individual acting in their territory. We also need to look at how do we address the question of dispute resolution. It is clear that no individual government can fight cybercrime in isolation. We need to coordinate our strategies. There has been the emergence of a shapeless, borderless domain and the absence of common understanding. I think we have seen the beginnings of very comprehensive definitions. We have looked at certain international mechanisms, and we have been an active partner in some of these. We have been participating in the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts, or the GGE, to study existing and potential threats in the sphere of information security and possible measures to address them, and examination of international concepts to strengthen the security of global information and telecommunications. We are working with the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific for dialogue on security issues in the Asia-Pacific to look at the possible cyber threat scenarios in the Pacific region and the likely security risks. Also, to develop a cybersecurity strategy for the region. We've also participated in deliberations of the UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. I think, some of these are not new ideas. We have indeed raised these before. We welcome initiatives by countries to define their own national strategies, as well as Mr. Delon mentioned, recent moves to develop international strategies as well. We are studying carefully these strategies as they are being announced by different countries. But I think we still have a long way to go to answer the initial question. I think we've made progress. I think there's a recognition by all governments, including my own, of the importance of securing cyberspace. The recognition also that it has to be a cooperation between governments and the private sector to ensure that we secure not just government infrastructures, but important private infrastructures as well in each country. And I think there's a recognition also that international cooperation is key. In that sense, we have come a long way. But when you look at the challenge ahead, and you mentioned the straw poll, and I think that's a clear indication that we all recognize that the threats are immense and we have very far to go. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Latha. And I was particularly pleased that you picked up in a number of your remarks on the difficulties or the challenges presented by law enforcement cooperation, effective law enforcement cooperation across boundaries, and also with national legislation, the difficulties of enforcement in this area, because our third panelist comes from the area of law enforcement, Shawn Henry, Executive Assistant Director, U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation. I think this is the first time that law enforcement communities have been involved in the EWI process, so it's particularly valuable to have Shawn Henry with us. I can't resist embarrassing him by highlighting that last year in 2010, Shawn was named as Cybercrime Fighter of the Year by McAfee, which is, I think, quite an accolade.
I'm waiting to receive one from Kaspersky next.
Sure, over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with such a distinguished panel and on such an important topic. Given the interest of time, I won't reiterate all of the discussion that many of my colleagues have had here this morning about the threat and the significance of the threat, the growth of the threat. I think that all of us, because of our involvement here, recognize that and how grave that is to all of our governments, our nations, and our economies. I'll just highlight a couple of points that I think are important to just make more solid. One is that organized crime certainly is a significant challenge as it continues to grow, and that the offense outpaces the defense. The solution to these challenges is not a technical solution. We can't tech our way out of the problem. There are people issues and there are policy issues, and those are all important points for us to discuss over the next couple of days. I think that the importance of education to our leadership, to our CEOs of our corporations, our general counsels of our corporations, is critical to ensure that they understand the situation that we face, and encouraging companies to discuss this openly, that they are not all independently suffering, that this is a worldwide crisis, and that they must report to both law enforcement and or regulators. I also think it's critical for us to look at business practices and business policies. for example, what we put on the networks and what we choose to transmit over the networks, and that things that we've become accustomed to might not necessarily continue going forward based on the threat that we face. So let me talk a little bit this morning about U.S. policy generally, and then more specifically about some of the challenges that we faced and some of the successes that I think we've had from the FBI perspective in coordination with our international colleagues. As many of you heard, and there have been some comments this morning about the U.S. government international strategy for cyberspace that was issued a couple of weeks ago. I know Chris Painter from our Department of State will be talking about that this morning in great detail. But essentially, the policy outlines the U.S. vision for the future of cyberspace and sets an agenda for how we partner with other nations to enforce it. Essentially, the strategy recognizes that the digital infrastructure is the backbone of prosperous economies and transparent governments, and that network technology holds immense potential for the world, the entire world, not just the U.S., obviously. The future that we seek looks to reward innovation, strengthen our communities, and to make better government and enhance international security. To achieve the environment that we all seek, I think, the policy proposes to create incentives and to build consensus around nations working together and acting together collaboratively as responsible stakeholders. We recognize that no institution or no document, no single nation can achieve the vision alone, so that we seek to involve as many stakeholders as possible to realize this vision. From the FBI's perspective and the law enforcement perspective, over the last year we've had some success in this area in mitigating the threat from multiple adversaries. We've used some aggressive and innovative techniques against cybercriminally organized crime groups that really have migrated many of their traditional criminal activity to the network, not solely as particularly using it as a communication device, but actually using the network as the target to monetize their criminal activity. Through the use of undercover operations, through the use of authorized digital intercepts, we've been able to penetrate some of these groups, identify the hierarchy at the enterprise level, and by arresting or sharing information with other partners, been able to mitigate some of these activities. The key to all of this is partnership. We've got to continue to develop existing partnerships and to build new partnerships. And I can say that there are many countries represented here in this room that our organization has had successful interface with your law enforcement agencies. The partnerships, we talk always about the partnerships at the private sector level, the corporate level, and we do have that dynamic relationship. But the robust partnerships that we've developed with international law enforcement is so critical. The FBI, we've got representatives in 75 countries around the world, and we've actually taken agents and embedded them within law enforcement agencies in other countries, where our agents are working full-time, side-by-side with their colleagues internationally. The ability for our agents to have immediate sharing of information and allowing that information to be actioned almost immediately has allowed us to have a very positive impact. The people, our personnel, have identified cyber organized crime groups targeting global infrastructure, and we've been able to support investigations really around the world. In 2010, we were able to, based on these partnerships, effectively arrest over 200 cyber criminals tied to organized crime groups. Many of these are some of the most prolific cyber actors that we've seen, using some of the most sophisticated techniques and having an impact to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars against financial institutions worldwide. In one of these particular cases, we had some actors who were able to penetrate a financial institution and access their payment services, and within a 24-hour period steal $10 million U.S. Throughout over 100 cities around the world using access devices. Our ability to partner with many different countries allowed us not only to identify those actors, but actually to extradite them and bring them to justice, which the success of a investigation and a prosecution, particularly at the global level, really, I think, helps to deter future crime by letting people understand that they are not immune from prosecution, regardless of how far away they are from their victim, that law enforcement working collaboratively can reach out across oceans, across continents, and touch them and bring them to justice. But those successes were not possible without the very, very close association and collaboration, working through some very challenging issues, different laws, different tactics, different acceptable procedures across nations, but by sitting down and collaborating, understanding that the mission is to impact the adversary, we've been able to overcome many of these challenges and have been accepted by governments and citizenry worldwide. Those challenges are compounded by privacy, by civil liberties, which are very important to us, and something that we have to balance on a regular basis to ensure that citizens recognize that our law enforcement agents and our governments are interested in mitigating crime, but by protecting the civil liberties and the privacy of our citizens. And that's something that we have to balance, and it's important for us to communicate. While we're doing everything that we can to mitigate the threat, it can't be done alone, and it will only continue through processes like this where relationships are continued to be developed. I encourage further discussion and debate about many of these issues. I look forward to hearing some of your questions, and I know that through commitment, continued collaboration, and effective prosecution, we can be successful against this significant threat. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shawn, and that was, I think, a very useful reminder that at the end of all the, if you like, the theoretical talk about policy on cooperation against cybercrime, at the end, this is a matter of law enforcement organizations working together on the ground on a day-to-day basis. I was glad also you mentioned the recently published US international strategy on cybersecurity, and for anybody who hasn't read that, I must say I think I would recommend it as a very comprehensive document, but also a very readable one, which certainly isn't true of many publications, either from the public or private sector in this area. I think a number of themes have come out of these presentations. A few that I'd pick out are getting the balance right. How do we get the balance right between state intervention, state regulation, and freedom of activity online? It's a very fundamental issue. Too much regulation, and we stifle the initiative, the innovation that has made the internet the benefit to the world that it is. But if we abandon all regulation, all intervention, then if we have a free-for-all, then it becomes free also for organised criminals, for paedophiles, for the bad things that can happen. So getting that balance right is a crucial feature. Another question I think that has come out is this question of whether existing international laws are adequate. Do they apply to cyberspace? And as far as the British government is concerned, for example, where the law of armed conflict arises, we believe it does apply to cyberspace. But that's another question for debate. And as we all agree, there's a need for international cooperation. I think the third question is really what form that international cooperation should take. The characteristics of cyberspace is that it's innovative, it's dynamic, it's constantly developing, and at a very fast rate. Whereas the traditional international mechanisms for addressing transnational challenges, security or otherwise, are not noted for their speed of conclusion. One only wants to look at the length of time it took to agree the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, for example, or to take another case, the 30-plus years it took to get near, and still not quite, universal adherence to something like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So these are the traditional international machinery for developing instruments of cooperation is very slow. I think there's a question there about are there other ways that we can approach this? We have about 10 minutes. I'll invite the panelists themselves to offer any additional thoughts, and then I think we will have time for one or two questions from the floor. Francis.
Well, Tim, very briefly, because I think you get a good synthesis of what was discussed before. I think there was a good complementarity between the different exposés. Law enforcement, this is an important matter, as you said. The question also of the legal framework in which we are acting. Is it sufficient? Is present legal framework applying to cyberspace? And the answer mainly is yes, but the other question is, do we need additional legislation? This is a question. And the third question, the one you mentioned also, I agree, is what kind of cooperation has to be enhanced. First of all, I think that this is not only a matter for governments, and the implication of the private sector is crucial because we are dealing with something that is different from the usual business, I must say, in terms of international law. Internet is of a special nature. But at the same time, I said also, and I reiterate that we cannot say that government should be completely absent from that. It is not possible. They have a part to play. So what kind of cooperation? I mentioned a few possible areas that could be of interest. And what form of cooperation? Should we need a treaty, for instance, a new treaty? Frankly, I don't think so, not at this stage. I think that we have to go on a step-by-step basis. It's probably more cautious and more efficient to try to go in the direction of some kind of code of conduct, some kind of good practices that could be implemented and that could be encouraged among governments, than going directly to new enforceable legislation. I don't think that we need that. We have sufficient legislation, but we don't know how to enforce it at the moment. This is the main point. I will stop there.
I was particularly interested to hear the comments, of a law enforcement agency representative. And I think that's very useful for us because, as you rightly said, we can make all the theory we like, but ultimately it has to be applied, it has to be enforced, and that can only be done through the enforcement agencies. Equally, as I tried to point out, where you can have a very strong national law, but can you really apply that? And again, I think that comes back to the enforcement agencies. You have to set up strong mechanisms to interpret the law and to actually put it into force. I think that applies as equally nationally as well as internationally. One aspect which I think I didn't touch on, which I meant to, was the problem that we face in many countries, that we're working in vertical silos. You know, whether it's the private sector is working on a certain aspect of cybersecurity, governments are concerned about certain hypersensitive issues, and the common public is worried about privacy and at the same time perhaps not fully aware of the risks that they run each time they go online. So there's a need to bridge the gaps between these different schools of thought and to point out that ultimately we're all equally vulnerable. And as I said, I think there is a need to come to some international agreements. Perhaps, as Mr. Delon mentioned, we should go step by step. We should try to evolve a code of conduct because, as we all know, international treaties take a very long time to negotiate. But we need to take some immediate action. And, you know, I would really be interested in hearing some more from you on how enforcement agencies actually do track down international cyber criminals, if you like. And because you did mention you've had some successes in this area. Thank you. I'll stop there.
So I think that the success that we've had coordinating with law enforcement agencies, we don't have the authority as a law enforcement agency to operate in foreign countries, but with our partners who do have that authority, by us sharing information about emerging threats, identifying the new techniques and processes, by sharing that intelligence with them, they can action that intelligence using their authorities, their laws, to effect an arrest, a search warrant, or some type of judicial action to help to mitigate the threat. I think a very good example is the recent Core Flood botnet, where a botnet comprised of over 2 million computers, where we identified within the United States command and control servers using both criminal laws and civil actions. We were able to actually seize those servers and seize the domains and actually stop the botnets. So we actually issued stop commands to the botnets, which was never done before. We shared that intelligence with the private sector, the ISPs. We shared it with foreign partners who were able to take actions in some of their countries where there were some command and control servers. And we shut off a total worldwide about 75% of that 2 million botnet. Again, just sharing of intelligence, sharing techniques, working within the laws of each of the different countries, we're able to have a sizable impact on a significant threat.
Thank you.
Well, I'm looking at my watch, and I'm also looking at the organisers to see whether they're going to allow me to have my ambition to get at least one question from the floor. I think, yes, we do have one. The first hand up, I think the gentleman in the... Could you just identify yourself and your organisation, and if you have a question to a specific member of the panel, say who, or if it's general, that's fine.
I'm Pavan Dugal. I'm president of Cyber Law Asia and attorney in the Indian Supreme Court. Quick question. World over, we've seen that extraterritorial jurisdiction of national laws doesn't work. Considering the fact that jurisdiction is a major challenge, and considering the fact that Internet has made geographic history, how are we proposing as governments to deal with this? Because without having adequate remedy towards jurisdiction issues, I think any kind of substantive action may face some procedural issues. Anyone in the panel?
Okay. Maybe that's a start for you, Shawn.
Well, there are many different international consortiums, international groups that are looking at commonality in laws. I think that we've operated in spite of that. So without specific international laws, I think that we have been able to use existing laws. And while many of those laws need to change to keep pace with technology, and we're doing that within our Congress now, looking at how we take laws and adapt them to the existing technology, we haven't been completely handcuffed. Understanding that sometimes the attribution that we've talked about and trying to determine venue is sometimes a challenge, but I've been very gratified by having somebody who's attacked U.S. interests be charged and prosecuted in another country. Because quite frankly, if they're taken off the field, they're out of the game. They're not part of that threat to us. And we have been able to operate successfully. But I think going forward there will have to be more of these international discussions about more commonality and make the playing field a much more even playing field.
Perhaps I'd just add to that in this area of law enforcement cooperation, it is one of those areas where, in fact, there is an existing international convention, the Budapest Convention that was originally sponsored by the Council of Europe, but is open for universal adherence. In fact, my own government ratified that convention, I think, only last week. So that is an example, perhaps, of where there is a case for some formal multilateral instrument that provides a framework for effective law enforcement. Perhaps take one or two more. Yes, the gentleman towards the back.
And the concept which is seen by both law enforcement agencies, the data needs to be mined out of it. Ability in this area varies. The FBI, I know, has a good ability in this area, but is there a need for greater cooperation among law enforcement agencies to secure not only cyberspace, but national security?
So the question relates to cyber forensics and the need, particularly as it relates to terrorism, and how do we share information or intelligence? Does that need exist? Absolutely. We recognize that as technology changes, our tactics have to constantly change. And by sharing that information and sharing some of our teaching, our education with our partners, it makes us all stronger. Because, as we've discussed here, it's not a U.S. problem or an Indian problem or a Chinese problem. It's a problem between good and evil, between people who wish to harm us, terrorist groups you're talking about, who want to impact our citizenry. Our success in that area, forensically, I think, has been shared, and we've had some successes against terrorist groups based on that exchange. So we have to continue to do that going forward, for sure.
There was a question from a gentleman down in the second row.
My question is, what is cybersecurity? How do you define cybersecurity? Is it including information security? If someone spreads some harmful information, so do you think it's criminal? In some countries, it's criminal activities, but in another country, it's not a criminal activities. So for the international collaborations on in this field, so how in the U.S. how do you think this activity?
Sorry, could you just identify yourself so we know who we're responding to?
Yes, I come from China, the Normal University, Beijing Normal University, a professor of law. So I'm interested in what is the cybercrime when we talk about this cybersecurity. Yeah.
Okay. I understand. Well, a very fundamental question there. How do you define cybersecurity? I think if we're at that, perhaps that rather points up that if that's still an issue of debate, it shows quite how far we have to go, nationally and internationally, in dealing with some of these challenges. But I'll hand this to some of my other panelists.
Thank you. For me, cybersecurity has nothing to do with the substance of what is circulating on the networks. Cybersecurity has to do with protecting companies against espionage, has to do to protecting companies and also governments against espionage, but also against sabotage, whether it is carried out by possible revolts regarding companies, by terrorist groups. This is a possibility that we have to take into account, by organized crime, as was mentioned before, in order to make money for them. And it has to do with that, protecting against espionage, protecting against terrorism. And we have to find ways and means to have better defenses against that, and we have to find ways and means also to prosecute the people behind those acts. So it has to do with that. It has not to do with the content of the information circulating of the networks. This content can be criminal, but this is another matter. This can be it can be protecting ourselves against cyber crime. It has to do with, this is another area. For me, it is completely another area.
I think I would agree with Mr. Delon there. You know, there is a difference between cybersecurity and cybercrime, and also between what could be the rules that govern information. As you rightly said, the information which is permissible in one country may not be permissible under the laws of another country. But I think here what we're debating is how do we protect ourselves against attacks in cyberspace? And that, to me, would be the essence of cybersecurity. The question of cybercrime is related, but not exactly the same. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I think perhaps I'd just add from the UK perspective that if we would share the views of Francis and Latha, that cybersecurity is really about the integrity of systems rather than the content. But I think we would go a little more broadly and say that when you look at what we are trying to preserve, which is the contribution that the Internet makes to international growth, to international trade, to international understanding, and indeed to international security, part of that contribution it does make is the windows it opens for free exchange of views, free exchange of ideas, and free expression. So there is the hard end of cybersecurity, which is very much this protection against espionage, protection against sabotage, and in the extreme, the risk of cyber conflict. But there is also this, what you might call the soft end of cybersecurity. Shawn, I don't know if you want to.
I agree.
I think we've got time for perhaps one more question. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Tom Espen. I'm from ZDNet UK. I have a question for Mr. Dowse and a question for Mr. Henry. Mr. Dowse, you said that the UK government thinks that the law of armed conflict does apply to cyberspace. I was just wondering, how would you go about defining the weaponry, and also how would you get around the problem of attribution? And Mr. Henry, I just wondered, you said that obviously you have to balance civil liberties with the need to, go after the bad guys. Is it possible to have targeted intercepts of web communications and targeted intercepts of mobile communications?
Well, I think your first question is probably would be better directed to somebody from our Ministry of Defence than somebody from the Foreign Office, but I will try and answer it, which is simply to say that defining the weaponry, I think, slightly misses the point. When we say that we think the law of armed conflict is applicable to activity in cyberspace, conflict in cyberspace, what we're really saying is that one should focus less on the means to which military effect is created, and one should look at the effect itself. If a cyber attack that causes damage, that causes loss of life, is still an attack that causes damage or loss of life, and one should focus on the impact, the effect, when one's looking at issues such as proportionality, such as impact on civilians, which are the sort of issues that the law of armed conflict addresses. So I think we would say in that respect that that is why we think that the existing law is applicable. But I think the attribution is, of course, I think that is more relevant in what you might call in situations where you are short of war. If you are fighting, I think our position would be that if one is in the situation of an armed conflict, we need to be prepared in future for that to take place in the cyber domain, just as it has in the past on land, sea, air, and space. So we need to be prepared to operate, but within the existing laws. I think the point about attribution becomes more relevant when you are not in a situation of armed conflict, and that is where the current focus that was started really by the UN group of government experts in their first report, the focus on developing norms of international behaviour, which are short of treaties, but nevertheless will carry real diplomatic and political weight. That is where that becomes more relevant.
So your question is about targeted intercepts of communications, mobile phones, and data, both. Yes, we absolutely can intercept targeted individuals or devices. That's done, though, through review of a judge, where we've got to show that there's a reason to believe that the individual whose communications device we want to intercept is involved and has violated some type of a U.S. law. So that's done with that oversight. It is very specific, and it's done to ensure that privacy is maintained and civil liberties are addressed and adhered to.
Okay, well, I've perhaps been a bit more of an active chair than I perhaps should have been, but this is an area which is so important now to governments as it is to the private sector, and I think it was a very important point that was made during this discussion, as it was in the previous panel discussion, that governments cannot operate alone. We absolutely have to have the involvement, the cooperation and the advice of the private sector and indeed academics and others, because we're all feeling our way in what is a new and in many ways quite unfamiliar territory for public policy. But I thank again very much to our three distinguished panelists and bring this to an end.
Well said.
I think I've just achieved